take my debt, to give me life, Son of God, exalt.
If you'd like to follow along, I'll be reading from Daniel, chapter 8, verses 5 through 8. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west, over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns. And the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns towards the four winds of the heaven.
Thank you, Patrick. Good evening. We'll have our blanket pleasantries. We have a bit to get to this evening because we have the last of our return from captivity to cover. We're going to, there we go. And we will also be dealing with the years of silence. We have Daniel gives us the years of silence, or the intertestamentary period, at least some of what goes on during that time. So we will touch on what the Bible says about this time. There's other things that happen that are noteworthy during this 400 years of silence, but we're not going to talk about those tonight because I just want to focus on what the Bible says about those. And so we'll finish up this time period here. So we're looking at the return from captivity, or what's called the post-exilic period. And we'll be covering Esther, Nehemiah, and Malachi, as well as Daniel chapters 8, 9, and 11. And this ranges from about 458 to 444. We don't know exactly where Esther falls in this bit. There's some ideas of where, but we don't know exactly where. Nehemiah finishes building the wall of Jerusalem in 444, and then scholars, since the formation of the Old Testament, have said that Malachi is after Nehemiah and the building of the wall, but we don't know exactly when, so I put a little, 444-ish here, because we know that Malachi comes after that at some point, or at least our best guess is that Malachi comes after that. So that's what we're going to be covering tonight. And of course, the years of silence, or the intertestamentary period, is from here until approximately somewhere between 4 and 6 BC, judging by all the details that were given about Christ's birth. They do not line up at 1 AD. Sorry, folks. Mr. Gregory got it wrong when he made his calendar. But anyway, somewhere between 4 and 6 is when we have our best guess as to when Jesus is born. So let's first look at Esther. Let's first look at the book of Esther. We're going to sort of summarize chapter by chapter the book of Esther. Of course, Nehemiah and Esther are the last books of the 12 books of history in the Old Testament. So again, by what we can tell, Esther actually chronologically comes first by our best scholarship. But Ezra and Nehemiah go very well together. There's also talk that Ezra and Nehemiah were actually originally one book, and we separated them as probably the Masoretes were completing their work of the text. So in the book of Esther, this is just a great book because if you love cinema, this is probably one of the most cinematic books of the whole Bible. And this is why, if you actually look at the number of films that are made about any scripture, Esther is the one that has the most. There are approximately 7 movies that have been made about Esther and her story, and so that's where people get a lot of cinematic value out of this, because who's going to write a better cinematic story than God himself? So let's look here at Esther. In chapter 1, we see that this Ahasuerus, that's the name that is given here. It is simply a title. It is the king of Persia. And so this could be Xerxes the First or Artaxerxes the First. Most scholars lean toward this being Xerxes the First. And actually, if you know the actual pronunciation of the Hebrew, see, we say Ahasuerus, and that's actually a butchering of the Hebrew. But the Hebrew itself sounds kind of like a butchery. But it is it's a transliteration of Xerxes. So that's more than likely who we're talking about here is King Xerxes, but we'll call him Ahasuerus because that's the name that we're given here. So he reigns from, it says here, India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. Remember the Persians, and really what's called the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medians and the Persians, who the Medians helped Babylon overthrow Assyria, and now the Medians have joined with Persia to overthrow Babylon, or Babylonia. So the Medians are kind of playing all sides here, but eventually they get swallowed up by Persia, and eventually it's just called the Persian kingdom here. But here we see King Ahasuerus. He's going to give many feasts, and he wants to parade his wife Queen Vashti or Queen Vashti because she's very beautiful. We see this in chapter 1 verse 11, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But she says no, she is not going to be paraded around. And so he gets very upset and really gets rid of her as queen. He does not have her killed. He just has her stripped of her power and begins to look in chapter 2 for her successor. And so he looks through the women of his kingdom, and he finds in chapter 2 Esther. Esther is taken, we see her name first brought about in about verse 7. Her name is actually Hadassah, but it says here that is Esther. And then it says that it is his uncle, the his there is Mordecai. There was at verse 5, now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So if you notice how that works, he is actually a descendant of the family of Saul. Saul is the son of Kish, who is a Benjamite. So this is we're a few generations down from there. But it says here, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Okay, so if it's his uncle's daughter, it's his cousin. And Esther in verse 8 is brought to Susa by the custody of Hegai, and Hegai is in charge of, it just says here, the women, but in verse 9 it is a harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, verse 10, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known, while Cyrus sent them back to the land of Israel. The Jews were all over the country, and many of them did not actually return, and they were not looked on very favorably. However, because she is so beautiful, she catches his eye, and in verse 17 is made queen. It says in verse 17, he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then we see in verse 21, Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate, and they have a plot to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. He tells Esther, Esther tells the king, and so by his knowledge, the king is then saved. And it says it's written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. And then in chapter 3, we're introduced to a man named Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and he promotes him very high over the people. But Mordecai does not give him the deference that he thinks he is due. He's not going to bow to someone. And it says here, he told them that he was a Jew, so he let himself be known. But it seems that this is common for Jews to not do this, perhaps extending back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it carried over into Persian law as well, but we don't know for certain. There's some concern about that from a scholarly standpoint. But anyway, so Haman decides he wants to get rid of Mordecai. He's frustrated with Mordecai, but that's not good enough. It's not just Mordecai. Let's get rid of all of the Jews because, one, he just hates them, but also they are Mordecai's people. And so he would rather see Mordecai fall and then take everybody else with him. I mean, we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of people, but that's how crazy Haman is. Well, Esther then learned, it says Mordecai, verse 1 of chapter 4, but he goes to Esther, and Esther then, it says, summons Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was, what this plan is. And so she decides that she is going to intercede for the people. And that's, she makes her plan known to Mordecai in verse 16. Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not permitted according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. You had to let the king know that you were coming, and the king had to approve your coming. But here, at the beginning of chapter 5, she's simply standing in the court. It says it in front of the king's rooms. And he sees her, but he decides he's going to waive this punishment. Once again, this is clearly, to me, clearly God's providence. Of course, Esther is greatly loved by the king, but I do think this is the providence of God. And so she decides to plan a banquet for the king and for Haman. And she's going to just invite the two of them. And just inviting the king would be rather normal for the queen. But to invite just one other person, that's an incredible honor. And starting in verse 9, it really goes to Haman's head. And as he is, ruffling his feathers and preening about, then he sees that Mordecai, once again, is not giving him the deference that he's due. And so he tells his wife all of this. He's complaining. Sounds like something someone in his position really has a right to do. A lot to complain about in his position, being second of the kingdom and all. But it says Zeresh in verse 14, his wife and all his friends, be careful who your friends are, said to him, have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. And so what does he do? Listens to his friends and builds the gallows. Then in chapter 6, it turns out that the king learns what Mordecai has done. I guess it was just recorded and not told to him. That or he had simply forgotten. But we see in verse 2 that he either remembers or is told for the first time what Mordecai did. And so he wants to do something nice for him in verse 3. He finds out nothing's been done for him, so he's going to do something for him. Haman thinks that he's talking to him, so he's, do all this wonderful stuff for him, thinking that he's going to do it for Haman. And to his horror, the king said, yeah, go do that for Mordecai then. And he finds out what the plan really is. And so, of course, all of this pride and parading he's been doing is now coming to a head. But now in chapter 7, we see that they come to this feast that Esther has asked them to attend. And it is there that she reveals that she is, in fact, one of these people that's destined to be destroyed because she is a Jew. And it says, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. She's really underselling what's happening here. But she said, I am my people to be destroyed, to be killed and annihilated. But don't worry, you're just a king. This is a really small matter, kind of trying to butter him up. But he says, who is he and where is he that he would presume to do thus? And she points to the only other man present, Haman. And it says, Haman became terrified before the king. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. So, of course, we know he's asking for his life. He's begging. But that's not the way the king sees it. The king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? And as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So they take him, and it says, I love this. It's just poetic. Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. I mean, we're just piling on insult to injury here. So it looks like not only was he assaulting the queen, but also trying to kill the man who helped save the king. Not looking very good. So what do? They hang Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai. And so, poetic justice. I mean, it's a story like this why we even care about poetic justice in the first place. And then we find that Ahasuerus sends out a decree saying that the people are allowed to defend themselves. And so we actually see that that's exactly what happens. The Jews fight back. It says in verse 11 of chapter 8, in them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and, as if that wasn't enough, to plunder their spoil. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And so we actually find, so this is in chapter 9, this event, as the Jews destroy their enemies in the first few verses of chapter 9, we see that starting in verse 20, we're going to institute a feast. And this feast, which is based on verse 24, says, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and to destroy them. So it's called Purim. And we actually see, it seems in John chapter 5, there is a feast mentioned that Jesus goes up to Jerusalem to partake on. And it's a feast that is held on a Sabbath day, according to the context of John chapter 5. And the only feast to be on a Sabbath day, to end up on a Sabbath day between 25 and 36 AD, is Purim, that's 28 A.D. And so we see that Jesus actually goes up to Jerusalem to celebrate Purim. And then we'll also talk about there's another feast instituted during the years of silence that Jesus may or may not, well, we can discuss that very briefly when we get there, that's established during the intertestamentary period as well. And then in chapter 10, we see that Mordecai is then exalted to the place that that Haman was. In a way, it says he's greatest among the Jews. It does say second only to King Ahasuerus, which was Haman's position, but there's also this connection that perhaps it's of the Jews. And so that's the story of Esther, God caring for all his people, not just the returned remnant. And that's one of the more important lessons from the book of Esther. God is there for his people, even the ones who did not go back to Jerusalem. So God's keeping track of all of his people. And then as we come to Nehemiah, we see Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. He is the cupbearer to the king. It's a position of honor and trust. He is the taster of the king's wine to ensure that it is not poisoned. So it's a place of great trust. And he hears what has happened to Jerusalem. It's broken down. The walls are completely broken. And so he hears about this and he becomes distressed in chapter 1. Then he is the cupbearer to Artaxerxes, which is believed to be Artaxerxes the first. And here Artaxerxes sees that that Nehemiah's face is sad in chapter 2, verse 2, which, knowing the law, that's also a very horrible thing. You did not look sad in the king's presence unless the king was also sad. Otherwise, we actually have records of people being put to death because they looked sad in the king's presence. And then it says, that's why it says at the end of verse 2, then I was very much afraid. And then the king says, okay, what's wrong? Tell me what's wrong, and what do you want in verse 4? And notice here in verse 4, it says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. I love that. It couldn't have been a long prayer, but it was a prayer. He needed God. And so then he asks if the king would allow him to go. And so his prayer to go and help the people in Jerusalem is answered. And then we see, starting in verse 11, he comes to Jerusalem. He's there for 3 days and then gets up in the middle of the night and inspects Jerusalem's wall and decides that we need to rebuild this wall. And so we actually find in chapter 3, many of these builders are named. Eliashib in verse 1, the sons of Hassanah, Meremoth, the son of Uriah, the son of Hakaz. So we see all these people are named throughout chapter 3, people who are getting to the work. Then we come to chapter 4, and we see that there are people, one named Sanballat. In verse 3, we also see Tobiah the Ammonite. And then in verse 7, we see that there are Arabs, which could be anywhere from the Syrians to Midianites to Moabites. And then we also see Ammonites and Ashdodites. So the people from Ashdod are Philistines. And so these people, they all hear what's happening with the wall. And they make fun of it, and it begins to dishearten people. However, the work doesn't stop. And it says that they filled in the breaches, and because of this, everyone becomes very angry. All these enemies become angry. And they fight against Jerusalem in verse 8. But they overcome with a prayer to God in verse 9. Then in chapter 5, we see that there is usury happening. And so they abolish usury in the land. And we also see that Nehemiah makes himself an example of living a more modest life to help everyone else to whom the taxation was very difficult upon. And then in chapter 6, we see that there's a plot by these enemies, particularly Sanballat and Geshem. But we know that Tobiah is also part of this. And they decide that they are going to try and prevent what's happening here. But, however, at the end of the chapter, beginning in verse 15, so the wall was completed on the 25th day of the month Elul in 52 days. So if you know how big Jerusalem is, that's an incredible feat to finish the wall of Jerusalem in 52 days, especially a wall that can actually repel enemies. So they worked very hard, but they're trying to frighten Nehemiah at the end of verse 19. Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. However, God's been with him so far. I can't imagine too much is going to frighten Nehemiah, especially his position in the kingdom, being the king's cupbearer. And then in chapter 7, again, it's one of these that we should really take the time to read. You should take the time to read this yourself, because this is God showing that he's been keeping track of all of his people. And so we see that the total number is 42,360 people that return. And then on top of that, 7,337 servants, 245 male and female singers. And then we also give cattle and their riches that came with them. In chapter 8, Ezra begins reading the law. And we see that because of Ezra reading the law, the people realize that they have not been obeying God. And so they're all weeping, which is the right response. They should have been weeping because they have not been doing for the Lord what they should do. But Nehemiah actually tells them, this day is holy to the Lord your God. Verse 9, do not mourn or weep. And so what they actually do is they make this a feast day. And they all eat, drink, and they have a great festival in verse 12. And then they restore the Feast of Booths from verses 13 to the end of the chapter in verse 18. Then we find in chapter 9 that the people confess their sin, that they had not kept themselves separate from foreigners. Some scholars will actually deny that Nehemiah should have had any dealings with this. However, this goes right along with the law that Ezra just read, and so it makes perfect sense, actually, that we would be abandoning these marriages and purifying ourselves. And so they make this prayer beginning in verse 5 and all the way to almost the end of the chapter, really verse 37. And then in verse 38, they decide that they are going to make a new covenant. And this new covenant is signed by those who are found in chapter 10, and the obligations of this covenant are laid out. And then we see in chapter 11 that the heads of the provinces are named, so we're establishing civil leadership among the people. And then in chapter 12, the priests and the Levites are named who return to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel. The chief Levites are established. They dedicate the wall and they go through the procedures of the temple. So Ezra just read the law, but now that they have Levites, they can establish worship in the temple. They needed Levites for that. And then we see in chapter 13 that foreigners are then kept away from the assembly, which again goes right along with the law of Moses. Most of these scholars, they're thinking about this in terms of the Messianic kingdom. The Messianic kingdom hasn't come yet. And so the foreigners actually are supposed to be excluded by the law of Moses. Then the temple is consecrated once more. The tithes and the Sabbath are restored. And then those who have mixed marriages are told that they must separate themselves because these marriages are forbidden. And so it ends in a kind of a strange moment here. We've had a lot of overcoming things, a lot of victory, and so we sort of end on this. But you have to remember that while this might be something sad, they are actually restoring themselves to Mosaic purity. So while it might seem very sad in the end, really they have learned the lesson that they were supposed to have learned all this time from the Mosaic law to them going away to Babylonian captivity. And so now they're coming to this moment of understanding. All right, as we look at the book of Malachi now, again, we as we go through the prophets themselves, we're looking for where Jesus comes up. There's 3 times that we see Jesus come up in Malachi. In the first 5 verses of chapter 3, it says, "Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me." And so this is really a reference to Matthew chapter 11, or at least Matthew chapter 11, verse 10 is referencing this moment here, as well as the sister passages of Mark 1 and Luke 1, and Luke chapter 7. And so he's going to bring this messenger, which is John the Baptist, and he will clear the way before Jesus. "The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming." And then we sort of switch from the messenger being John the Baptist to the messenger being Christ. "Who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? He is like a refiner's fire and a fuller's soap. He will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver. He will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord as in the days of old, as in the former years. I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be a swift witness against sorcerers, adulterers, those who swear falsely, who oppress the wage earner in his wages, the widow, the orphan, and those who turn aside the alien and do not fear me." And then in verse 16 of chapter 3, that comes up. We talk there about this book of life, or really it's called a book of remembrance, but the analogy is for the book of life. And so he says that he will take a book of remembrance of those who fear the Lord, and there will be those who are one with Christ. And then in chapter 4, verses 5 through 6, we have mention of Elijah the prophet, who, once again, this comes from Isaiah. We're pulling from Isaiah, which is a reference to John the Baptist as well as Christ, sort of a 2-in-1. Verse 6, "He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so I will not come and smite the land with a curse." And that's the end of the Old Testament as we know it. Now, we're going to look very quickly at the intertestamentary period. For those of you taking notes, do not bother trying to take notes here. I'm going to go through this very quickly. However, I can give you my notes here so you can apply them to your own notes later if you would like. A lot to get through here. So, in chapter 8, we see that Greece is going to destroy Persia. We have yet to see that in the Old Testament, so this is something that happens in between. We see that this is Alexander the Great leading an uprising to overthrow Persia. And Persia has its own attempts to overthrow this uprising in Greece that all fail. And so then we see that when Greece destroys Persia, as Patrick was reading for us, Alexander the Great, who's represented in this one horn on this goat, is separated into 4 horns. And those 4 horns are the Ptolemaic, the Seleucid, the Pergamon, and the Macedon empires. So this is his general Ptolemy, his general Seleucus. Pergamon was his general Lysimachus, and Macedon was his general Cassander. And they all sort of separate the Grecian Empire amongst themselves. And then we also, in chapter 8, there's this little horn that grows up from these 4 horns and makes himself great, magnifies itself in verse 11, which by all accounts is a reference to Antiochus the 4th Epiphanes. And so we see him prophesied here. That is more of an inference from what we know rather than we absolutely know from Scripture who this is. So keep that in mind. That's from our scholarship of the intertestamentary period. Then over in chapter 9, very briefly mentioned here, is a period of 70 weeks and the Messiah. And we see that there is a 69-week period of the 70 weeks that seems to be a reference to this intertestamentary period. 62 weeks is this intertestamentary period, and then we see the Messiah comes in verse 26, and then we're dealing more with the New Testament time, so I didn't include that here, so I only went 24 to 25. I stopped at 26. And then chapter 11 is where we have the most. And again, I'm going to go through this very quickly, but the reason I want you to see all of these points, we're going to go verse by verse. Again, I'm going to go quickly. How much God prophesied in incredible detail. And we know this, again, from our scholarship of this intertestamentary period. We see that in chapter 11 and verse 3, that Alexander the Great is prophesied. In verse 4, this dividing of the kingdom that we just mentioned from chapter 8 is brought back. And then beginning in chapter 5, we begin talking about the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. And the kingdom of the north is the Seleucid Empire, and the kingdom of the south is the Ptolemaic Empire. Seleucus had much of what we know as sort of like the Babylonian, Mesopotamian area, as well as extending through quite a bit of Asia Minor and down to Israel. So a very large, the largest chunk of the empire that was split. And then Ptolemy had Egypt. And so they're going to begin fighting. There's going to be an arranged marriage. And this arranged marriage here in verse 6 is going to be Berenice, his daughter, and Antiochus the second Theos. So there's again a lot of similar names here. And since I'm going so fast, it's going to get fun. Verses 7 and 8 then bring Berenice back and talk about her child, who is Ptolemy the third Euergetes, and how he is going to take control and invade Antioch in Syria. And we're looking anywhere from 246 to 243 BC. And then we're going to see, let me make sure, okay. Verse 9 references Seleucus II, who fails to invade Egypt. And thus we have Seleucus III, Cyrannus, and Antiochus III. And these are sons that stir up strife. They muster an army to invade Egypt from the Seleucid Empire into the Ptolemaic Empire. However, Ptolemy the Fourth is actually victorious, and the Holy Land, or what's called repeatedly in chapter 11, the Beautiful Land, goes to Ptolemy the Fourth. Then Antiochus III partners with Philip the Fifth, and so as Ptolemy the Fourth is sort of parading himself around, he is then caused to retreat by this partnership with Antiochus III and Philip the Fifth. And then in verse 16, Antiochus III, because of Ptolemy's retreat, then controls the land. In verse 17, we reference Cleopatra I and Ptolemy V. This is not the Cleopatra we know, but this is Cleopatra the First. I don't remember if the Cleopatra we know is the second or the third, but we will talk about her in just a moment. And then in verse 18 is prophesied Antiochus III's defeat. And it mentions in verse 19, he will turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, which is the fortress Elymaeus, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. And while he's going to try to plunder Elymaeus, he sort of falls off the face of the planet, and we never see him again in history. We don't know where he is or what actually happened to him, but it's just said that he died. So we don't know much more about that. Then another Seleucus IV Philopator, takes control of the Seleucid Empire. And then in verse 21, now we have Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, who's the object of God's great wrath here in this section. So he's going to come up and take power. It seems that there's a reference to, our best guess is the priest Onias the Third, and he joins up with Antiochus the Fourth. And so Antiochus Epiphanes goes to invade Egypt. But to his shock, as he puts Ptolemy the Sixth in his place while he goes down to Egypt, he finds that the two brothers, Ptolemy the Sixth and Seventh, they are not father and son, they are brothers. They reconcile and say, hey, while he's down in Egypt, let's take over everything, which makes him very upset. And when he comes back in and completely destroys them, I mean, it's not even funny. He does everything he can to try to uproot Judaism in the area. And going to the length of sacrificing a pig in the temple on the altar, which is, and he also erects an idol, and that's called the abomination of desolation. There's also another abomination of desolation that's going to be discussed later as well, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Then Antiochus Epiphanes then returns to Egypt. However, he finds that Rome is meant to come and destroy him. And then there's a rumor of Antiochus Epiphanes' death. And so then Jason, one of his sons, I believe, if I remember correctly, says, oh, well, since Dad's dead, I'm going to take over. And that, again, makes him unhappy. This is actually where he comes in and sacrifices the pig, is actually during this time. I also, around here, in verse 28, this is where we have the events of what's recorded in what's called the Book of Maccabees. And in that, we have the establishment of the Feast of Hanukkah due to what was happening during the Maccabean revolt. And it seems in John chapter 22 that perhaps Jesus is actually celebrating the Feast of Hanukkah. Scholars have kind of gone back and forth, but he is in Jerusalem in the temple when people are in the temple praising during Hanukkah. So he's in the temple, but he's not praising God. I don't know. But it seems that my take is he's celebrating Hanukkah with the rest of his people. And then as Antiochus comes back and destroys the land once more, we have an abandoning of the Mosaic law, and all those who are faithful to it begin to be persecuted. And thus we come to the end of the vision in verses 34 and 35. Many people have said, oh, this is now the end times, because we have to deal with all of that nonsense. But really what we're talking about is the end of the vision concerning Antiochus Epiphanes. And so a little bit more that Daniel talks about. Rome is the foreign god mentioned in verse 39 with the help of a foreign god. And verse 40, we have a reference to the Battle of Actium. And then in verse 41, Octavian is going to conquer Palestine. That's coming from Macedon on down and Pergamum on down. We're sort of reuniting the land. And Octavian will then conquer Egypt next from verses 42 through 45. So what's the purpose of all that? I mean, you see how much detail God put in here. And what's interesting is most of what we read at the end here is all post 200 BC. And yet we know we have the completed Old Testament text prior to 200 BC at the hands of the Masoretes. So we know that this is all prophecy. There are those who will say, oh, we went back and added, but no, the complete Masoretic text was done prior to 200 BC. We know that these things were prophesied. And so to prophesy in such great detail, I mean, if you weren't sure about anything else, whether or not you should trust the Bible, here we go. You have all of this at your disposal as well. So let's think about some practical lessons as we finish up here. When we look back to Esther, God uses everyone at his disposal to accomplish his will. There is not a person that is outside his purview to use them for his own purposes. And here he uses Mordecai and Esther to great effect and saves his people through their actions. In Nehemiah, we saw that we need to continue to work no matter who our enemy is and no matter what their threats are. There is nothing that we can be threatened with more than losing our place with God for eternity. Nothing else is worth it. And then looking at Malachi, Jesus and John both announced 400 plus years before their arrival. I mean, again, if that's not enough to convince you, prophecy and fulfillment, I'm not sure what else there is. But there's a little section in Malachi that we didn't talk about because, again, it wasn't specifically about Jesus. But Jesus has this moment where he talks about the people robbing him. And the exchange there is they don't understand what that means. And he's telling them that they have given him nothing of what he asked. They'll promise the best of their flock, but they give him a lame sheep. They promise that they'll follow the feasts, and they're not following the feasts. They'll praise him, but then they work on the Sabbath. And as we look at this, he says, "You've robbed me, and I will make it right." But when we think about ourselves, are we robbing God? Are we not giving him what we promised we're going to give him? Are we not letting him work through us? Are we not working no matter the enemy? Are we not paying attention to all the evidence that God has given for his existence? And if because of that we're faltering and we're not giving it our all, perhaps this is the time. This is the time for you to do something. We're going to sing a song, "There's a Fountain Free." While we're singing that song, you're going to have an opportunity to come up and make your life right with him. And if you're willing to do that, we're here to help you. But you need to ask yourself that question, is this what I need? And if you're asking yourself the question, chances are the answer is yes. Yes, you do need to come forward and make your life right with him. If that's what you need, either to become a Christian or to come back to him in your salvation, then please come forward while we stand and sing.